I played that other place in Hollywood. It was at an upstairs and a downstairs.
For over 40 years, Woody Allen built himself into one of Hollywood's most protected names. But the cracks were always there. The Polaroids found by a fireplace in January 1992. The 21-year-old adopted daughter. The 7-year-old girl in a Connecticut attic. There were whispers about more victims, rumors about destroyed evidence, and accusations that even his closest friends could not explain. What really happened in those last months before everything collapsed? And why is an 89-year-old man who once won 4 Oscars now finishing his life this way? The real story goes deeper than anyone imagined. Woody Allen was born Alan Stewart Konigsberg on December 1, 1935, in the Flatbush and Midwood area of Brooklyn, New York. He grew up in a cramped home that was often noisy and tense. His parents, Martin and Nettie Konigsberg, were second-generation Jewish New Yorkers, and money was never fully secure. His father moved from one job to another, working at different times as a jewelry engraver, a salesman, a taxi driver, a bartender, and even a bookmaker. His mother worked as a bookkeeper. So, from the beginning, Allen lived in a world where financial stress and family arguments were part of daily life. That early atmosphere stayed with him. Later, it would show up again and again in the nervous couples, sharp arguments, and restless New York energy that filled so many of his films. As a boy, he spent 8 years in Hebrew school, and then went on to Public School 99 and Midwood High School. In those years, he soaked up Brooklyn slang, Jewish humor, and the rhythms of city life. That world shaped the public image he would later make famous. The anxious, talkative, inward-looking New Yorker people came to know on screen had roots in those early streets, those family tensions, and that very local way of seeing life. Even the way he later joked about preferring to stay alive in his apartment rather than in people's memories seems to fit the small, closed-in world he came from. By the time he was in his mid-teens, he had already started turning himself into someone new. Quietly, Alan Stewart Konigsberg became Woody Allen. At around 15 or 16, he began sending one-line jokes to newspaper columnists in New York, especially Earl Wilson. Before long, he was making up to $200 a week, which was a remarkable amount of money for a teenager in early 1950s Brooklyn. These were not childish jokes dashed off for fun. They were sharp, polished lines about marriage, show business, and city life. He was writing for adults he had never even met, and they were paying him well for it. He also wrote for local performers and for an ad agency, producing joke after joke every day. That steady pace trained him fast. It taught him how to turn fear, awkwardness, and failure into material. While many of his classmates were still thinking about college applications, he already had clients, income, and a new name. Then college barely lasted. In 1953, he enrolled at New York University, but his time there went nowhere. He even failed a motion picture production course. After one short and unhappy year, he dropped out and moved straight into television writing. That decision changed everything. By 19, he was writing for major television shows such as The Ed Sullivan Show, The Tonight Show, and programs linked to Sid Caesar. He worked around people who would later become giants in comedy, including Mel Brooks and Larry Gelbart. In 1958, he joined Caesar's writing staff, where the demands were brutal. Deadlines came fast. Sketches had to work. A weak joke would die in front of millions. That pressure sharpened his instincts. He learned structure, timing, pacing, and how to place a joke so it landed at exactly the right second. Those skills stayed with him and later shaped the fast-moving, tightly built comedies that made his name in film. Still, even with that success, he felt restless. Writing jokes for other people no longer seemed enough. He felt that too much of his best material was disappearing into someone else's performance. So, in 1961, at around 25, he took a step that felt risky and exposed. He began performing stand-up at a small Greenwich Village club called the Duplex. At first, he was shaky on stage. He gulped for air, stumbled over lines, and looked deeply uncomfortable. Yet instead of hiding those weaknesses, he used them. Slowly, he built a stage persona around them. He became the nervous man in glasses who seemed overwhelmed by everything, from dating to dentists to the meaning of life itself. Rather than relying only on short nightclub gags, he spoke in full paragraphs about psychoanalysis, death, sex, and his own endless anxiety. That style set him apart. By the middle of the 1960s, he was widely seen as one of the top comics in America. He released successful comedy albums, appeared on national television, and refined the same troubled, funny persona that would later move almost intact into his films. During the 1960s, he worked carefully to turn Woody Allen from a stage act into something larger. Stand-up gave him a voice, but records, Broadway, and film gave that voice reach. Between 1961 and 1964, he performed in New York clubs and shaped a persona that felt awkward, personal, and oddly intimate. In July 1964, he released his first comedy album titled Woody Allen. On it, he talked about psychoanalysis, Judaism, sex, and social discomfort in a way that sounded spontaneous, though every beat was carefully built. The album helped carry his voice far beyond the clubs. Now people who had never seen him live could hear the style that made him distinct. He sounded like a man confessing his fears in public, and that sense of private panic turned into comedy became his signature. At almost the same time, he found success on Broadway. Don't Drink the Water opened in 1965 and ran for more than 600 performances. That mattered because it proved he could hold an audience for a full evening, not just a few fast minutes. He could build a whole comic world, keep it moving, and sustain it. Then came Play It Again, Sam, staged on Broadway from 1969 to 1970. In that work, his public image became even clearer. He played a romantic, insecure man who was overwhelmed by women, confused by his own desires, and trapped inside his own mind. By then, the Woody Allen persona was no longer just a comic style. It was a full character, and audiences knew exactly who he was the moment he appeared. That whole process led naturally to Take the Money and Run in 1969. This was the turning point, because here, at last, Woody Allen wrote, directed, and starred in the same feature. He played Virgil Starkwell, a hopeless bank robber whose failures unfold in a mock documentary style. The film gave Allen the control he had wanted ever since the disappointment of What's New, Pussycat. This time, the jokes, the structure, the rhythm, and the tone were his from beginning to end. The movie also showed how deeply failure fascinated him. Even when the story was silly, humiliation stayed at the center. His characters did not move through life with confidence. They stumbled, worried, improvised, and embarrassed themselves. That was where he found comedy, and also something that felt true to him. By the end of the 1960s, he had already built the pattern that would define his career for years. He could write, he could direct, he could act. More importantly, he could make all three roles serve one continuous image of himself. The jokes from the clubs moved onto the screen. The fears stayed the same. The Jewish identity jokes stayed. The talk of therapy stayed. The romantic confusion stayed. What changed was the scale. Woody Allen was no longer just a comedian people heard at nightclubs or on records. He was becoming a filmmaker who could shape an entire world around his own obsessions. That world grew much larger in the 1970s. During that decade, Allen transformed from a gifted comic into a major figure in American film. He still used fast jokes and physical comedy, but he also began carrying bigger themes inside the humor. In Sleeper, released in December 1973, he played a health food store owner who wakes up 200 years in the future. The film was full of visual comedy and absurd situations, yet beneath the surface, it kept touching fear, control, and the madness of politics. Then came Love and Death in 1975, which played with Russian literature and philosophical ideas while circling back again and again to mortality and moral confusion. These films convinced many critics that Allen could do more than make people laugh. He could take comic energy and guide it toward deeper questions. That shift reached its highest point with Annie Hall in 1977. On the surface, it was a love story about a nervous New York comedian and a younger aspiring singer. Yet the film felt new because it moved with freedom. It broke normal storytelling rules. Characters spoke to the camera. Time bent and jumped. Memory and fantasy mixed with ordinary scenes. Even with all that invention, the story remained emotionally direct. People connected with it, and so did the industry. By April 3, 1978, Annie Hall had won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Actress for Diane Keaton. Allen himself was also nominated for Best Actor. In a gesture that only deepened his odd public image, he skipped the ceremony and stayed in Manhattan to play clarinet at Michael's Pub. That choice fit the legend that was forming around him. He seemed like a man who wanted success and also wanted distance from it. After Annie Hall, he became something much larger than a successful filmmaker. He became a symbol of intelligent American cinema. His films now influenced romantic comedies, television writing, and the image of urban neurotic life in popular culture. At the same time, certain patterns inside the work grew harder to ignore. Again and again, he returned to the figure of an anxious, older intellectual man, involved with a younger woman, who found him appealing. In Sleeper, in Love and Death, and in Annie Hall, variations of that dynamic kept appearing. At the time, many viewers treated it as part of his quirky screen identity. It seemed like one more odd trait in the Woody Allen world. Later, after his personal life came under intense scrutiny, those earlier films began to look different. That change became especially stark with Manhattan, released on April 25, 1979. In the film, Allen plays Isaac, a 42-year-old television writer who is dating Tracy, a 17-year-old high school student played by Marielle Hemingway. The movie presents their relationship with tenderness and intelligence, and for many viewers at the time, the beauty of the black and white photography, the music, and the polished dialogue softened the discomfort. Most critics focused on the style and emotional tone. The age gap did not receive the moral attention it would draw later. After the revelations and accusations that emerged in the early 1990s, Manhattan was revisited by many people as something far more unsettling, almost like a reflection of desires and choices that would eventually move from fiction into public reality. By the end of the 1970s, Allen had become almost an institution. Between Take the Money and Run in 1969 and Manhattan in 1979, he released film after film at an astonishing pace. Awards recognition followed. Prestige followed. Actors wanted to work with him. Studios made room for his habits, including his refusal to play the usual publicity game. A shield had started to form around him, built from consistency, acclaim, and the belief that he was one of the great artists of his generation. That kind of reputation carries power. It shapes how people speak, what they ignore, and how long they hesitate before questioning what they see. That power only grew stronger in the 1980s. Hannah and Her Sisters, released in 1986, became both a commercial success and a critical triumph. It earned strong box office returns on a modest budget and received 7 Oscar nominations, winning 3, including Best Original Screenplay for Allen. Nearly a decade after Annie Hall, it confirmed that he was still viewed as one of the rare American writer-directors who could satisfy critics and still reach a broad audience. By then, he was no longer just admired. He was established. Mia Farrow became central to that phase of his life and career. She first entered his professional world in 1982 with A Midsummer Night's Comedy, and from then until 1992, she appeared in 13 of his films. Over that stretch, she became the face most closely associated with his work, taking the place Diane Keaton had once held in the public imagination. On screen, she fit naturally into his world. Off-screen, their lives became deeply connected, even though they never married. They lived in separate places, with her in Connecticut and him in New York. Yet their partnership became one of the defining personal and creative relationships of his decade. To understand why the discovery hit with such force, it helps to see where Soon-Yi stood in the family. She was born in South Korea around 1970 and was adopted by Mia Farrow and her then-husband, conductor Andre Previn, in the mid-1970s. Allen never adopted her. He never lived in the same apartment with the family, and for years he insisted he was never her legal or emotional father. Even so, from the early 1980s onward, he was the much older man regularly visiting her mother, moving in and out of family life, taking photos, and directing films that often involved Mia and the children. Soon-Yi would later say that Andre Previn was her father and that she never saw Woody Allen as a stepfather. But by 1992, the public saw a powerful older man involved with the young adopted daughter of the woman he had been with for over a decade. And that image was impossible to separate from the scandal. Mia's reaction was explosive, and the breakup quickly turned vicious. She sent Allen a Valentine's card with a family picture altered in a way that made her pain unmistakable. Soon, the private disaster turned into a public war. By August 13, 1992, Allen had filed for custody of the 3 children tied most directly to him and Mia: Dylan, who was 7, Moses, who was 14, and Satchel, later known as Ronan, who was 4. What had begun with those Polaroids now spilled into courtrooms, headlines, and sworn accusations. In 1993, a New York judge denied Allen custody and sharply limited his visitation. The judge also described his conduct in terms that badly damaged his standing. At the same time, Allen's public image changed almost overnight. News that a 56-year-old director had been secretly involved with his partner's 21-year-old adopted daughter forced people to revisit the way they saw him, both on screen and off. In August 1992, he issued a statement saying he was in love with Soon-Yi, but that did little to soften the shock. To many people, the affair seemed to echo the age gaps and blurred lines already present in some of his films, especially Manhattan, where a 42-year-old character dates a 17-year-old girl. Long before the culture shifted in later decades, critics were already asking whether Allen had long presented boundary crossing as something witty, romantic, or harmless. Allen's defense of the relationship took shape early and barely changed with time. He said the affair began only after Soon-Yi was an adult, in late 1991, when she was about 21, and that the relationship was consensual. He stressed that he never adopted her, never acted as her guardian, and never lived as her stepfather. In his own telling, there had been no betrayal of a parental role because that role never existed. He made that position public in 1992, and years later he held to it just as firmly. In December 1997, he and Soon Yi married in Venice. Decades after the scandal began, he continued to say he had no regrets. Yet while that controversy was already consuming his private life, another accusation emerged that would follow him even more relentlessly. In August 1992, during the ugly custody fight in New York, Mia Farrow told authorities that Allen had sexually abused their adopted daughter Dylan at the family's country home in Bridgewater, Connecticut. Dylan was 7. The allegation came only months after Mia had discovered the nude photographs of Soon Yi in January. Mia also claimed Allen had become unusually fixated on Dylan, constantly touching her, cuddling her, and staying physically close in a way that alarmed relatives and friends. Those investigations became a battle of reports, experts, and competing versions of the truth. In 1992 and 1993, the Connecticut State Police and a child abuse team at Yale New Haven Hospital spent months interviewing Dylan and other family members. The Yale team, led by Dr. John Leventhal, produced a report in 1993 after about 7 months of work and concluded that Dylan had not been sexually abused. The report suggested she had trouble separating fantasy from reality and raised the possibility that she had either invented the story or been influenced. Around the same period, a separate New York child welfare inquiry also found no credible evidence that Allen had abused or maltreated her. Allen leaned heavily on those conclusions and would continue to do so for years. Still, the matter did not end with those findings. Connecticut State Attorney Frank Mako announced in September 1993 that he would not prosecute Allen. He said there was probable cause, but he also said that putting Dylan through a trial would cause too much harm. Allen denied the accusation completely and called it false and disgraceful. He argued that Mia, enraged by the collapse of their relationship and by his involvement with Soon Yi, had pushed Dylan into a story that was not real. He repeated that claim again and again over the years, saying she had been coached or coaxed, and pointing out that he was never convicted of abuse. Then came the custody ruling, and that ruling added another layer to the public record. On June 7, 1993, after a 7-week trial and about a month of waiting for the final decision, New York Supreme Court Justice Elliot Wilk awarded Mia Farrow full custody of Dylan, Ronan, and Moses. Allen was denied visitation with Dylan, and his access to the other children was tightly restricted. In his opinion, Wilk described Allen as self-absorbed, untrustworthy, and insensitive. He also said Allen's behavior toward Dylan had been grossly inappropriate, and that protective measures were necessary. Just as striking, he criticized the Yale New Haven report, calling it sanitized and less credible than it appeared. That meant the central official document Allen had used to defend himself had already been doubted by the very judge overseeing the custody battle. For years, the scandal remained part of Allen's story, but in 2014 it roared back into public view. On February 1st of that year, Dylan Farrow, then about 28, published an open letter in the New York Times. In it, she accused Allen of sexually assaulting her in the Connecticut attic when she was 7. She described being told to lie on her stomach and play with an electric toy train while the assault happened behind her. The letter landed just after Allen had received a Lifetime Achievement honor at the Golden Globes, and that timing made the impact even stronger. Media outlets that had been praising his career only days earlier now had to reopen a painful and deeply disputed case from the early 1990s. Allen answered quickly with his own written response. Within a week, he published an op-ed insisting the accusation was part of a smear campaign by a bitter former partner. He pointed out that no charges had ever been filed, and again relied on the 1993 Yale New Haven report, which had concluded Dylan was not abused. But critics focused on what happened around that report. Justice Wilk had already said it was sanitized, and less credible, and the fact that original interview notes had been destroyed only deepened suspicion. In a case already filled with doubt, that decision sounded astonishing to many observers. The dispute grew even more intense in 2021 when HBO released Allen vs. Farrow, a four-part documentary series built largely from material created during the 1992 and 1993 crisis. The series showed grainy videotape shot by Mia Farrow, in which young Dylan repeatedly describes the alleged abuse in childlike but strikingly steady language. It also included home movie footage of Allen with Dylan and audio from tense private phone calls, in which Mia confronted him about both the attic accusation and his relationship with Soon Yi. The series argued plainly that Dylan's story stayed consistent and that the system failed her. For many viewers, it was the first time the old case felt immediate, rather than buried in old headlines. That series also pushed the Yale report back under a harsh light. During the original custody proceedings, child psychiatrist Dr. Stephen Herman had testified that the Yale team's methods were seriously flawed. He questioned the number of interviews, the destruction of notes, and the way a polished final summary replaced the raw record. Critics also pointed out that Dr. Leventhal signed the report, even though he had not personally examined Dylan or Mia. Meanwhile, Frank Mako and Justice Wilk had both expressed serious reservations about the report's reliability, even though the prosecutor had declined to bring charges. Because of that, the same 1993 document ended up serving two opposite purposes at once. Allen's defenders treated it as proof of innocence, while his critics treated it as one of the most troubling parts of the entire case. Then the culture shifted again. When the Me Too movement surged in late 2017, Dylan Farrow's 2014 letter took on new force. People who had once treated the allegation as a distant and messy family battle began reading it through a very different lens. Between early 2018 and early 2019, several actors publicly distanced themselves from Allen. Timothée Chalamet, Greta Gerwig, Mira Sorvino, Rebecca Hall, Rachel Brosnahan, Colin Firth, and Michael Caine were among those who either said they would not work with him again or donated their salaries from Allen-related work to organizations focused on abuse. The debate around Allen stopped feeling like a relic of the 1990s and became part of a live reckoning unfolding in the present. That shift hit his career hard. In 2019, Amazon argued in court that it was justified in walking away from a multi-picture deal reportedly worth as much as $68 million. The company pointed to renewed attention on the allegations and to Allen's own comments about Me Too as a serious risk to its brand in the American market. Allen's side insisted the company was using an old accusation as cover to escape a contract. The lawsuit ended later that year in a confidential settlement, but the message was already clear. Whatever his legal defense might be, his name had become a commercial problem in the United States. Money had always mattered to Allen, and that became obvious in another lawsuit years earlier. In May 2001, he sued longtime friend and producer Jean Doumanian, along with her partner Jackie Safra and their company Sweetland. He claimed they had cheated him out of at least $12 million in profits from 8 films released between 1994 and 2000, including Bullets Over Broadway, Mighty Aphrodite, and Sweet and Lowdown. Under their contract, Allen was to receive $1.5 million for the first film, $2.5 million for each later film, and a 50-50 share of profits. The fight centered on accounting methods and cross-collateralization, which could allow losses from one movie to swallow profits from another. Allen testified that under such an arrangement, he could keep making films into old age and still never see any real return. That case pulled back the curtain on the business side of his career. Behind the anxious, comic figure seen in many of his movies was a director deeply focused on controlling both the creative and financial terms of his work. Lawyers argued over the fine print of film contracts, how profits should be counted, and who had proposed the partnership in the first place after TriStar Pictures dropped him in the early 1990s. Allen said Doumanian and Safra had approached him and insisted he would never have knowingly accepted such broad terms if they threatened to bury his profits. The fact that he was willing to sue a friend of more than 30 years over millions of dollars showed how tightly he guarded his work and his revenue. Years later, his legal struggle with Amazon showed how much the terrain had changed. The Doumanian case was about accounting and ownership. The Amazon dispute was about whether his public reputation had become toxic. In February 2019, Allen filed a $68 million breach of contract lawsuit after Amazon Studios canceled a 4-film deal first signed in 2016. That agreement had included a $10 million advance for his first movie under the partnership, A Rainy Day in New York. Amazon argued that renewed attention to the abuse allegations, along with Allen's comments about Me Too and the refusal of major actors to associate with him, made the deal impossible to continue. His lawyers said the company was hiding behind an old and baseless allegation. The case ended quietly, but it reflected a deeper truth. Allen was no longer fighting only for money. He was fighting a shrinking place in the culture. By the late 2010s, the challenge was no longer getting films made. It was getting them shown in America. A Rainy Day in New York, which had been shot in 2017 under the Amazon deal, struggled to secure a normal American release while finding distribution overseas in places like France, Italy, and Germany. That pattern continued with later films such as Coup de Chance. Allen himself noted that distribution in North America was no longer what it once had been. The contrast with his earlier career was striking. Films that once opened as major cultural events now arrived as limited releases abroad or failed to gain traction in the United States at all. His footprint had narrowed from mainstream fixture to a far more marginal figure. As American support faded, Europe became increasingly important to keeping his career alive. He turned toward European financing, tax incentives, regional film support, and locations in cities such as Paris, Barcelona, and Madrid. Reports in 2025 described him, then 89, securing about 1.5 million euros in regional backing for a planned film to be shot in Madrid. By the standards of major studio production, that was modest money, yet it was enough to keep a veteran director working. This shift let him continue chasing his long-stated ambition of making dozens of films, but it also revealed how much his position had changed. The American studio system that once helped define his career had largely moved on.